Good morning, everybody. Would you like to take your seats, please? Okay, so welcome back to day 2 of the Coaches Conference. Please, can we just have a bit of hush, please? Thank you. I'm glad that you're all discussing lots of coaching issues. So I have a few housekeeping things I want to talk about, and then I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So the first thing is that there are several different things going on today. So there's a Federations Conference, which is in the meeting room out of here and turn right. And so if people want to come and go between the Coaches Conference and the Federation Conference, they are welcome to do so. The other thing is that today we have parallel streams for nearly the whole day. And so we would very much like you to make a choice about which one you go to. So this morning, the first session, we have Nick Baker, who's going to talk about para rowing and setting up para rowing in your country or your club. He is the coach for the GB team, one of the coaches for the GB team, but also has a lot of experience of coaching in the club setting as well. And Nick is in the Endeavour room. So if you go out of here and go straight across the corridor, you come into the Endeavour room. So in a minute, I'll ask if people want to go to that session, if they would like to move. And then this afternoon, we have got some very short update sessions, and you have the opportunity for the Coaches Conference to go to 3 sessions. And there's a choice of 3 at 3:30, 3 at 4 o'clock, at 4, and then 2 at 4:30. And you just need to make a choice, and we'll let you know which rooms those are going to take place in as well. So please just have a look at the programme there. So if anybody would like to go to the Paralympic session, please can you go now so that we can start the first session. And people are welcome to go. It says BR members only, but please, it's not just BR members. Is anybody who'd like to go? Right, so thank you. I would like to introduce Jean-Christophe Roland, who is the president of the FISA International Federation. And he's going to take us through the first part of the FISA update. So welcome, Jean-Christophe.
Thank you, Rosie. Actually, we'll do this session in 2 voices. Matt, Executive Director of FISA, will join me in a moment, and we'll have this session together. So good morning, everyone. I hope you are well. And I think, as Rosie has mentioned, we have in the room not only the coaches attending or the participants of the Coaches Conference, but also delegates from national federations attending the National Federation Conference. So how is it going so far for you? Good, I think. We have a 1 hour and 15 minutes session to discuss and to share with you the FISA's matter for the future of our sport. Just a very brief logistical aspect. I appreciate it has to be an interactive session, and I would like you to take part, to be interactive, and to give your comment. But just to make it, I would say, more efficient and to ensure that we can finish on time, I suggest that we will go through the presentation and keep some time at the end so that you have the opportunity to ask any questions. So please, if you have a question, please make a note, and then we'll come back at the end of the presentation. So, obviously, some of you will have heard already some of the message I'm giving today, but if there are the usual suspects in the room, we can see also new faces, and it's important that we keep the message, we convey the message to everyone so that everyone in the room can be at the same level of knowledge. So, some of you will have seen this slide. If you remember, when we prepared the Exonic Congress in 2017, we were thinking about the future of our sport. And as a sport organization, as an Olympic sport, we have an Olympic cycle. And so that's how we can build our strategy over 4 years. And if you remember, we had prepared the Congress, the Exonic Congress in Tokyo in 2017, and we are now in the process to prepare the Exonic Congress in 2020 that will be held here in London in October 2020. So for us, the future, I mean, we are in this process, and there are two key aspects of next year that will be a very important year for the sport of rowing and for FISA. First, as I mentioned, the next year at the Exonic Congress, it will be the opportunity for us, and it's only one every 4-year opportunity, to amend, to change the rules and statutes. This is in our Olympic cycle way to run the organization. We can change the rules and the statutes only once every 4 years. So obviously this has to be prepared and anticipated, and I will come later on this. So this is one of the key aspects that will come next year. The other point is about the Olympic program for Paris 2024. I'm sure you have seen the new logo of Paris 2024. We have moved from the candidate logo to the official Olympic Games logo. I hope you like it. Nope, no reaction. Okay, this is the other key aspect for next year. The Paris 2024 Olympic program will be decided by the IOC Executive Board. So for us, obviously, this is also a very important aspect for our sport. Just to have a look at this timeline, you know it. This is the approach we have been adopting even for the last Olympic cycle to ensure that we are fully prepared for these very important decisions for our sports. So to be prepared for the October and for the Exonic Congress in October 2020 and for the IOC Executive Board decision in December 2020, we have launched this exercise, this 4-year-long exercise that started actually right after the Exonic Congress in Tokyo in 2017. You will remember we have launched this 2017 project just to start the preparation of the next this very important deadlines. So where are we now? We are almost at the end of the process. We have started this exercise, and all these red triangles was where the opportunities we give the federations, the coaches, and all our internal stakeholders to share and to be included in that exercise. For us, one thing is very important is not to give you the final proposal at the very end, but to start with the exercise at the very beginning. And that's why some of you who have been part of this from the start, you have seen the progress and how we have built all these proposals. So now we are almost at the end. of the process, and we want really to be ready. And at the council meeting in February next year, we will finalize all the proposals that will be sent to the federation, so that when it comes to the time to take the decision, everyone had a chance to be part of of what we will propose, and we will not start the debate again. There is a phase for discussion, there is a phase for decision, and in that final phase, we will not reopen all the discussions. So this is very important that you understand and that you take part of all the process during all this exercise. So, two aspects. We'll come back later on what will be the proposal for the status change and the rules change. And Matt will take that part in a moment. But first, let's speak about the Olympic strategy. I will say it again. You all know that it's important, and it's foremost important for our sport to be strong in the Olympic movement. And it's very important for our sport to be strong in the Olympic program. And you have already heard this message, but you know that if we are not, I would say, in danger as a sport, we are at risk, like all the sports, because the context has changed, and now the IOC is evaluating every sport, every event at each Olympic Games, and will review the program every 4 years. So it's not because you are in that you're safe. It's not because you have a program that it will be automatically reconducted for the next Olympic Games. And the pressure are very high, not only for rowing, but especially for rowing, and for two reasons. And this is something that we have been discussing with the IOC, but also with you, the National Federation, with you, the community of rowing. We have two main issues. Quotas. No need to say, we are at the top of the list in terms of number of athletes. This is one of the key elements we are fighting on. And the second point, and this is something that you all know, the challenge we are facing with the weight category, and I will come back later on this. In terms of quotas, the Olympic Charter said that the Olympic Games have approximately 10,500 athletes. And actually, if you look at in the past, Rio and also for London, for Tokyo, sorry, this number has been a little bit exceeded, and the IOC has decided, because of all the pressure in terms of organizing the Olympic Games, to stay with this threshold. So in Tokyo, excuse me. In Tokyo, the total number of athletes is 10,616 for the 28 core sport. And as you know, there will be 5 additional sports representing 474 athletes. But the decision for Paris will be actually twofold. First is to stay within the 10,500, but also to include in that total number the athletes of the additional sport. You know that for the Olympic Games, and it's in the Olympic Charter, there are 28 core sports, but then the organizing committee has the flexibility to present to the IOC additional sport that will make sense for them for this specific event. They are not Olympic sport per se, but they will be in the program of that Olympic Games. For Paris, and it has been decided last year by the IOC session, there will be 4 additional sports, and they will represent 248 athletes. You know these sports. You have breaking, you have roller skate, surfing, and climbing. So based on this decision, the 248 has to be included in the 10,500. So it means that for the current 28 sports, the IOC is pushing to have a reduction by 364. And again, we have to admit, as being one of the sports at the top of the list, that we will have to contribute to this exercise. Not easy. Second aspect, and you have heard this many times, we are challenged for the weight category. We don't have to convince ourselves. We know how much the lightweight have brought to our sport. We do know how lightweight are important for our sport. This is not the question. The question is being seen from outside of rowing, being seen from a multi-sport organization. When you look at all the constraints and all the pressure around, they look at rowing as being a privileged sport. Why would this sport have that large number of athletes at the Olympic Games? And why would that sport have a weight category where it's not legitimate? So again, for this, we have started from the very beginning to try to find the way to keep our lightweight in the Olympic program. It was a project, a 2-year-long project with experts, with lightweight participation, and also with external participation from consultants to try to build the way to respond to this challenge. At the end, I must say it was difficult, but we didn't find the argument, we didn't find the way to respond to the IOC challenge. And for those who were in the room when IOC President Bach presented us in Plovdiv, the message was clear. Yes, the IOC has been supporting us for the Tokyo 2020 program when we saved the lightweight double, but time has changed, pressure is still there, and it won't be the case for Paris 2024. So it was clear. So our strategy was to move from this defensive mode to try to defend the lightweight in the program and to see how we could move from that threat to an opportunity for our sport and to look at the future. The answer to that was actually to think about having a proposal to the IOC to move with a constructive and to take to move this threat into an opportunity. And the answer is coastal rowing. Okay, at the time we started to think about this idea, the level of that discipline in our sport, because it's quite, I would say, not young, but less old than the normal rowing, obviously. It's a 20-year, it started 20 or 30 years as a competitive sport. It's still not at the, I would say, Olympic standard. But when you look at the trend, when you look at how this discipline is evolving, and as leaders of our sport, we need to look at the future, at the long term. And for us, this is the way to answer to all the challenges. Again, the idea is to remain in the Olympic movement and to remain as strong as possible. And this is one of the answers. So let me just make it clear, because I heard some rumors about, well, will coastal rowing replace Olympic, the flat water rowing? Absolutely not. This is absolutely not the intention, and we will keep our sport like it is. There is no way that it's a replacement. This is just to answer the current challenge, and we believe that it will help us, and it will actually help the IOC to respond to their challenges. The challenges that the IOC is facing is our challenges. And we believe that by introducing coastal rowing in the program will benefit to our sport. Let's have a look at what we had this year at the beach sprint in Shenzhen. So this is one of the formats we have in coastal rowing, is the beach sprint. But as you know, we have also another format, and this is the video of the highlights of the World Championship held in Hong Kong recently. So again, we can see a lot of potential in this discipline. It's not, I can hear some arguments about the level of the sport level, etc. But again, we are looking for the future, and I can tell you that the development of this discipline and the potential of this discipline are really significant. And this is how we believe to save our strong position in the Olympic movement. So, about the timeline, this has been shared. Where are we now? We are in the, I would say, in the last part of the decision-making process. This is the proposal we are, working on in FISA. But at this point in time, as we speak now, there is no guarantee, there is no decision. This is a long process. We have started actually quite a long time ago. As you can imagine, this is not a decision that can be built overnight, but we are moving step by step. And I must say that so far so good. We have opened door by door up to now, and we are still on track. We are still on track means that all the discussion we are having with the IOC are, I would say, quite positive, and we are still working and explaining and defining with them what would mean having the coastal rowing event in the Olympic Games. So the next steps to come are that all the IFs will have to provide by February next year, February 2020, their proposal for the Paris 2024 program, so that the IOC can work on this. And we have just actually received a survey that we will work on to present what could be the program for Paris 2024. And then, based on this, the IOC will also work with the IOC Program Commission. And one very important aspect will be the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. That will, the IOC will have a full review and evaluation and analysis of the 2020 Games. And that will be delivered by October 2020. Based on this evaluation, based on all these discussions, then the Olympic Program Commission will make a recommendation to the Executive Board to take the final decision in December 2020. So for us, again, what at stake? It's quite sure that the two lightweight events are gone, and the idea is to save the number of medals and to save as much as possible our athletes' quota in the program. So we are working on a program with 3 coastal events, moving from the 2 lightweight double to 3 coastal events, including the 2 solos and a mixed double. So we have just received the draft of the questionnaire from the IOC to build the program for 2024, and as you can see, our main arguments are there. Endeavor to use existing venues. This is I would say one of the strongest of our argument to say that we don't need any additional venue. We'll use existing venue. Would it be sailing or surfing? This is under discussion, under investigation, but we don't need the organizing committee to set up another venue. Obviously, we will have to keep it in the quota, and also we will achieve the 50% of gender balance, but this is something that we have already achieved for Tokyo. Based on, on this ongoing discussion with the IOC, this is not. We have different aspects that are on the table of the discussion. Not only the quota and the event in Paris. We are discussing the YOG, the Youth Olympic Games 2022 in Dakar. We had the site visit early this year, and it was clear that the normal Olympic flat water rowing was not appropriate to the situation. There are no, I would say, appropriate piece of water that could stage this event. So the decision was made for Dakar 2022 to actually have coastal rowing. And that's why it's very linked with our Olympic strategy. Very linked with our Olympic strategy because it will make the organizers' life easier. For us, we will be included in a cluster, on a beach, in a cluster with other sports. So it makes a lot of sense. It will reduce the complexity of organizing the rowing event. We will be part of the Youth Olympic Games. So we tick actually many boxes by presenting coastal rowing for the YOG. Based on that, I appreciate that we haven't everything built today to present this. So we know where we come from in terms of participation at the Youth Olympic Games, but we have now to build the selection system, the qualification system, and most importantly, we have to build that we will have athletes prepared and young athletes prepared for that event. And this is how we have, the National Federation have to contribute. And obviously this is not new today, but I do hope that you, the National Federation, you, the international rowing community, have anticipated and started the program so that we will have young athletes competing in coastal event at the YOG 2022 in Dakar. We are working on the qualification process system. We think that probably we'll have continental qualification to ensure the massive participation like we had in the past. And this will be obviously under scrutiny by the IOC. So it's very important for us in all this discussion we're having that we do have a strong plan for the YOG 2022. And we just have received a couple of days ago the confirmation about the event and the quota for Dakar 2022. The good news is we have been able to increase the number of athletes. If you remember, I think we had 96 in Buenos Aires with coastal rowing, because we have explained that at the end of the day, it will cost much less in terms of materials, in terms of organizing the event. We have succeeded in increasing the number of athletes participating at the YOG 2022, which is a very good news. So 60 of each gender. And it will be in 5 events: solo men and women, the 2 double sculls, men and women's, and the mixed double sculls. So, but this last event is subject to a strong exercise to ensure that we can we can convince the IOC that we have a strong development pathway, and so that this is not something that completely new that we would not have anticipated. Obviously, we have the mixed event already at the World Championships, but it's important that we respond to this challenge from the IOC, and we ensure that we have the pathway. So this is very important for the National Federation to start, and not to start hopes it has already started, but to build on this so that we can be ready. And again, the trend is very good. I'm sure that the potential of this is significant. Another aspect, and based on this Olympic strategy, as I told you, it's not like we have to deal with every aspect one by one. It's a full package of discussion, and that also makes us much stronger when we have all this, I would say, high-level view. The other aspects, it's about the discussion we are having on the 2028 Olympic Games venue for rowing. You know about the situation and the proposal alternative that we are investigating in Long Beach to avoid to be in a I would say far away from Los Angeles, with a sub-village in a project where the legacy is very low. So the alternative under investigation, as you will remember, we have presented this now for more than 1 year, and actually I think it was in Berlin last year the first time we mentioned it. So it's Long Beach. Again, rowing would be part of a cluster of 4 or 5 sports. So a lot of very good aspects to consider here in the middle of a very crowded town. So in terms of attractiveness, would be fantastic. This is the 1932 Olympic Games rowing course. But as you know, there is this issue, a big issue, this bridge, and we have to cope with that in terms of alternative to investigates. So now, as you will remember, we had two options in this alternative. Option A was 1700, and it was like we could move a little bit after the bridge, but it would have meant to reduce the number of lanes and to have only 4 lanes. We investigated. The technical team had meetings on site, but we can say now that the initial 1700 meters option is not viable. We cannot cope with the constraint and to move over this bridge, having in mind that all the boats from the marina and from this part, and also these boats, will have to have access to the ocean from here. So it would mean the 1700 meters option is not possible. So this is the only alternative now that we are investigating and discussing with LA 2028. It's the 1500 7 lanes course. Again, this is part of this discussion that we are having with the IOC to make sure that rowing is not too complicated with a lot of constraints, and if our community at the end made this choice to exceptionally move from 2,000 to 1,500 for that very specific event, I can tell you that the perception from the IOC there will be really positive, in a sense that rowing is flexible enough to adapt and to ensure that we will reduce or help in facing all the challenges the organizing committee are facing. So it's really important if we do believe that for the future of our sport it's important and we can move to this. Obviously, should all the technical aspects be matched in terms of feasibility, this would be a tremendous step in our discussions. Moving to Paris 2024, as you know, the rowing will be held on Invers-sur-Marne. Most of you will probably know the venue where we already had in the past some events, World Cup. The area has been refurbished. I mean, it has been inaugurated in June this year, so ready to go, no problem. I won't go too much into details. One aspect I would like to share with you is about as you know, there is it's 42 kilometers from the Olympic Village, and the organizing committee has worked with the IOC actually to reduce the cost of the games. Let's say it that way. They have investigated all the aspects, and one of the key aspects is the size of the Olympic Village. And the Olympic Village actually is built on the top on the maximum load, which is on the weekend in the middle of the game. So the capacity is based on what is the maximum requirement, which is only on 2 days or 3 days of the 3 weeks, and this is quite. I mean, this is not efficient, basically, costly speaking. And so the discussion was, how can we avoid this peak and to make the capacity much more, adapted to the average. And one of the answers was to investigate with the sport who are not that close to the village. We know by the past, by experience, it was a case in London, it was a case in Beijing, in Rio. Some teams, for the specific competition, will accommodate their athletes close to the venue. They have, obviously, each athlete has a bed in the Olympic Village, but he or she will not use it because he or she will be accommodated in a hotel, because the National Olympic Committee will obviously try to give the best condition for these athletes. So instead of being forced with such kind of situation, they have built a proposal to actually give incentive for the teams to be accommodated near the venue, so that they will, on the other hand, they will save on the capacity of the Olympic Village. So this was sent to the National Olympic Committee. As rowing is concerned by, or is impacted by such a position, I would like just to understand who in the room has been informed or is aware about such an incentive that was proposed by Paris 2024. Because it went through the National Olympic Committee. So your National Olympic Committee should have been in contact with you, because it would mean that a MOU had to be signed, so that you can, if it's a case, the team will be accommodated in a hotel near the venue. They will take in charge the accommodation. They will take transportation, and you will get even more VAPPs, which mean vehicle access parking permits. You will get more additional team officials accreditation. They will give some incentives to ensure that some of the teams will be accommodated not in the Olympic Village during the competition, but near the venue. So it's very important, because Paris 2024 went obviously through the National Olympic Committees, but I wanted to understand if it has come to you that it's an option, because actually, if you think it's good for you, you will have to sign and to commit, so that at the end they can save the space in the Olympic Village. Just to let you know, they have for this exercise, they have moved the capacity of the village from 16,500 to 14,500, and at the end, it makes a very significant saving in terms of cost. So the deadline was the 1st of November. I appreciate that you don't know how many athletes you will have qualified for the Paris 2024 Games, and it's just to commit that should your team be qualified, or the whole team will be accommodated near the venue. So I think it's important that you have this information, and if you are not aware, please do contact your National Olympic Committee so that you can discuss with them this option. Okay, now I will leave the floor to Matt, who will present the Exonic Congress changes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. So we're going to review with you some of the changes. We will have a dedicated session later this morning about the statutes at the National Federations Conference, but we're going to give you a few key points on the statutes, but review with you the suggestions and proposals for rules of racing changes. Again, we are shooting for October 2020. We will be sending to you the proposals from the FISA Council in February, so that we have plenty of time to study it, review it. National Federation alternative proposals are due the 15th of July. This will be explained to everyone. And then we will send the final proposals on the 15th of August, just after Tokyo. And then we'll meet here in London Park in Heathrow for the Extraordinary Congress. So start with a few key changes on the statutes, and then we'll go to more detail on the rules of racing. And these have been developed by the governance working group. So these are proposals from the working group that are going to the council at its meeting in February to be discussed, and then will be sent after the council reviews them to everyone in the famous three-column format with the markups, so you can have plenty of time to study them. These are the 10 key items that are being discussed for the statutes that will be covered in detail at the next session in the National Federations Conference. But a few key ones are clarifications of responsibilities between the governing groups, between the Council, the Congress, and the Executive Committee. With the auditors and with review by Swiss law and Swiss lawyers, we are consolidating the management responsibility with the Executive Committee, management and financial responsibility of FISA with the Executive Committee, which is how it is stated on the Price Waterhouse audit, and that the sport elements are the responsibility of the Council elected for their sport-specific knowledge and experience. So the Executive Committee members are elected based on the criteria, will be with this better clarification of responsibility on criteria of management and financial oversight, where the council members are elected based on their sport-specific experiences and knowledge. So this is a new look. We'll distribute this and you can see it, but I just wanted to point out this is the first change to clarify between the governance bodies in FISA of who is doing what. The supreme authority is the Congress, the national federations, and we work for you. But this is how it's organized. The second change or major proposal is we can say a restructuring, a readjustment of the commission structure to recognize the importance of coastal rowing and indoor rowing as really fully official disciplines of our sport. So we're proposing to create Coastal Rowing Commission and Indoor Rowing Commissions, and the current Competitive Rowing Commission will become the Flatwater Rowing Commission. These will be people, experts, day-to-day working in these disciplines of our sport, who will be asked to develop proposals, ideas for approval by the Congress and the Council. The next is we're discussing and going to propose that the Women's Commission become the Diversity and Gender Equity or Equality Commission. We're following the trends in international sport and in current culture, and diversity is critical for our sport to move forward. We must create more diversity, and of course, coastal rowing and indoor rowing will assist with that, but we also must institutionalize, let's say, gender equality within all of our work of our sport. So diversity and gender equality are critical international issues for us. Next one is the Events Promotion Commission becomes a working group of the chief executives of the World Championships, not a commission, and that roles and responsibilities under development are continuing to evolve. For example, coaching education would be a part of the responsibility of the 3 discipline commissions, because we need to develop coaching education materials and information for all 3 disciplines. So the development staff and the coaching director will be working with each of those commissions to get their expertise, but we will continue to professionally develop coaching education and deliver coaching education as it is now. So that's an example of how that affects that change. So the commission structure would have 13 commissions instead of the current 12. Coastal, Flatwater, Indoor are the so-called discipline commissions. And the supporting commissions, athletes continue, women's becomes diversity and gender equality, equipment and technology continues, events, masters, recreational rowing. So rowing for all includes coastal and indoor. So those will evolve out into coastal and indoor, and the recreational rowing aspect will become a commission on its own. Para-rowing, sports medicine, umpiring, and youth. So this is the proposal that will go to the council, and then eventually, after discussion, will be distributed to the national federations. Now to the rules of racing, and I'll spend a little more time on the key proposals. We've had a working group working on the rules of racing, and we have 12 actually key areas we'll share with you. First is we have about once a month a new proposal about how we can put a new gizmo on an oar to make it electronic, to make it mechanical and go faster. And we're going to institutionalize the fact that an oar should be a simple device that meets these criteria. So no moving parts, no mechanical elements, etc. So it's currently in the bylaws, it's going to move into the rules, our proposal to move it to the rules. The nationality rule, we're just going to make sure that we clarify that, because there's the way it is worded, it's not clear if it's 2 seasons, 2 calendar years, whatever. So we have to clarify that rule, and it doesn't mean that you don't compete during that 2-year period. You compete for whatever the current nationality, but you must obtain the new nationality if you change it and have that for 2 years. So that's the principle we want to retain, we think is correct, but we need to clarify the wording of this rule so that we don't have misunderstandings. We want you to know that it's a big discussion in the international sport movement how to appropriately deal with transgender and differences in sexual development athletes. And if you followed World Athletics, it's a big discussion. And we want you to know FISA is deeply involved in this to develop the appropriate guidelines and rules about how to deal with transgender athletes, particularly male to female. We will be following the international trends, the IOC, and we will have a proposal later when it is solidified, let's say. But we have appointed a transgender advisory panel who are experts deeply involved in the IOC discussions and the athletics discussions so that we have an appropriate rule for our sport which corresponds with the international approach. Swimming. We all know that this is a fundamental basis of participation in the sport, the ability to swim or tread water, and we don't really deal with it in our rules. So we think it's really appropriate now that also in the rules of rowing of FISA, the ability to swim or tread water is very clearly defined, and that it trickles down into your work. Many of you already have it. But that it goes down to the clubs, that we really be sure that people we're putting out in boats are able to swim or tread water. So we're looking at how to approach that, and we're working on the wording, but we think that that's such a basic, fundamental issue that needs to be addressed in our rules of racing. We are reviewing the Rule 36, the World Championship programs. You recall in 2017 we changed to a fully gender equal program, but we kept the natural death rule in there for the non-Olympic and non-Paralympic events. Currently, some of those events are at risk. And if in bled we don't have the appropriate number of entries, according to the natural death rule, they will have to be removed from the program. But in October after bled, 2020, bled is August, we'll have the chance to present the new Rule 36, a new World Championship program, and vote on that. So the Rules Working Group is proposing, actually, that we consider that a wording something like this: the Council will make continual analysis of the World Championship programs based on principles and strategy, and propose every 4 years the most appropriate program to the Extraordinary Congress to be valid for the coming 4 years. Because it's so connected to the strategy and to policies, one being gender equality, we think it has to move to this kind of level where a full program is presented and discussed, and not a discussion of individual events. And we'll collect the entries after Bled to see how we're doing on developing the events that are at risk. Okay, when we've had poor entries, of course there's discussion, if there were 2 or 3 entered, should we cancel the event? Well, flights have been booked, hotels have been booked at the entry deadline, it's too late. So we feel those athletes trained all year for the World Championships, and not enough, or not very many entered. So we're not comfortable for the World Championships proposing a minimum limit of entries, but there's some discussion to consider: do we give medals to all the boats if only 3 raced? And not everyone's convinced that this is the right thing to do for the World Championships, but perhaps the principle that you have to beat at least 1 crew to get a medal is being discussed. So, not easy one. They train all year, they show up to the World Championships, and they're denied a medal because someone else didn't show up. It's a tough one. So there's not a clear consensus on this, but we wanted to put it, this is where we are on discussing this idea. Innovation, we get a lot of ideas on how we can make things faster in rowing, and we think it's appropriate to clearly state where we think innovation is positive for the sport, but that really to make the sport faster isn't our goal. You've heard the discussion, we should keep it 5 to 7 minutes in maximum endurance strength activity. There are many definitions of how to describe it, but going faster usually means more expensive or more complex. And that's not something we're seeking. We are seeking better safety, better hygiene, simplicity, cost reductions. Those are things that would be considered positive, but not more expensive, more faster, or more complex. So we're discussing, should we explicitly state so that people don't spend a lot of time creating an innovation idea and it comes to FISA and it's shut down. Okay? So, and really it's really important we keep our sport lower cost, simpler, less complex to continue the development around the world. Not everyone probably agrees with that in this room, but we have currently this bylaw about sponsorship by betting or gambling companies, for-profit companies. We do allow sponsorship by, we call it here, state lotteries owned or operated on behalf of the state authority. That is allowed to sponsor events or sponsor crews, but not private for-profit betting companies. So we're considering to move that to a rule level. And then we just wanted to remind you, we still have the hard alcohol, strong alcohol and tobacco prohibition at the junior events, etc. But moving the betting issue to be a rule, not a bylaw. We've had a couple instances recently where there was a very late medical change. Crews were on the water, crews were at the start, and they were held up because there was a last-minute medical issue. And we really debate between the positive approach to help the crew with the ill person, the other rowers and a healthy one to go and have their race, versus the negative impact on the rowers that plan their warm-up, plan their strategy, are at the start, and they have a big delay suddenly announced to them. So we're trying to balance that out and find out the right, the appropriate, the fair way to handle it. For example, in Sarasota, we had a big delay in the men's quad with 30 degrees or more temperature because of a last-minute medical issue, and we held the race for 27 minutes, I can't remember, with poor communication around the venue and not very good information to the rowers at the start, sitting there having made their warm-up ready, and it was very uncomfortable, a very difficult situation, but we held it, they made the change, and all 6 crews raced. We had a similar situation in Linz. A guy got sick during warm-up. The crew came back, and we put a 10-minute maximum delay on the start. The other crews were on the water at the start. They could replace the sick rower and have the 6 boats race for the Olympic qualification, but very difficult. So we're considering having a limit. When is the limit to make a medical substitution so that it goes to the FISA doctor, it's reviewed, the spare is found, it gets into the system. We didn't know, to be honest, in Sarasota, who was in the boat for the television commentary, for the graphics. So we're considering putting a limit on the change of medical substitution, but with a little bit of an extraordinary circumstance discretion by the starter. Probably not everyone agrees. We don't agree, all of us, on this approach, but we think there needs to be a line somewhere, a guideline. We often have questions at regattas, can't we go out training before the official opening of the course tomorrow morning? We really want to train early, and we say, we don't have the rescue crews ready. They're arriving at 7 or 6:30. If you go out, it's at your own responsibility. It's really uncomfortable because it is still, all of us, all the stakeholders are liable for the safety of the rowers. And I don't need to mention how important the rescue function is to be in place and operating effectively. So we're thinking to make it a rule that training may only take place during the official opening hours of the venue, of the course. So it is really clear, black and white. If you violate that, really isolating liability and responsibility on the violators. But we offer safe, with rescue crews, trained rescue crews, training conditions at our events. So we've said, and we experienced this year in Rotterdam, that we need to provide better, detailed information on when and how we do time trial races. And over the years, it's become clear the teams prefer prioritized lanes the later we are in the progression system. But we know for the progression system to work, we need to have good heats, equal and fair heats. So it's becoming more and more obvious we need to be better prepared for the heats. If we have thunderstorms all morning or a consistent crosswind on heats day, and we can't delay, we can't risk delaying, the weather forecast is not good, so we need much more clarity, and we're going to have an appendix actually with different scenarios on when and how time trials are applied. So the officials know, Swiss Timing knows, the teams know, the coaches know, everyone knows exactly, okay, scenario 3, all right, here we go. So that's, we're working on the wording for that. Finally, the final slide here is for any of you who have been to the endurance coastal racing, you know that the 3 crews that cross first aren't always the 3 that get medals because of protests. And for the credibility of the endurance coastal rowing, we need to find a mechanism that the three crossing that everyone sees, that television sees, those are the three medalists. And there's many other sports that have a similar type of approach, biathlon, cross-country skiing. If you have a penalty, you have to do a mini lap or something so that those crossing the line are really the medalists. And we need to just fix this so we have a fully credible format where the winners are seen crossing first, second, and third. So we're working on how to play that out. Okay, those are key changes. Again, we'd like to finish the presentation and then take questions at the end. So I'm going to keep going. This first is the strategic event attribution process, just to make sure everyone's aware that we have now instituted this 4-year attribution of events at one time. We had fantastic participation by national federations and organizing committees. We had a very competitive process. We're really proud of that because many sports are struggling to find organizers with the huge increase of a number of events. And this is what the 4-year calendar looks like, 21 to 24. But we have a couple that we call it the repechage round, where we are in the middle now of a process to appoint them in February. So the full 4-year calendar will be finished in February 2020, but this is where we are now. We're going to try the combined juniors and under 23 in Varese, like we did in Rotterdam and like we will do in St. Catharines. We are still working with Paris and the French Federation on the junior championships in the year before the Olympic Games, but otherwise it's going. So the current bidding process, we're working on these events here, the first World Cup in 2024, European Championships 2024, European Under-23s 21, indoors all the way through, coastal through to 23 on the 2 disciplines, and then the European indoors. So those are the events that are currently open for bidding. If you aren't aware of this and want to be included, contact us. Liz Suter, our sport manager in FISA, is following this process. Following these attributions, we are piecing together the 4-year calendar. And I know you can't see it. We are going to send out now to all the national federations this chart. I've done some preliminary consultations with some overseas, some non-European federations, and we want to point out the feedback is for many of the countries, they come to Europe and stay for 12 weeks. So for them, if the World Championships are in Europe, they really appreciate that the timeline is that 6 weeks, the final regatta, the final World Cup, is 6 weeks before the World Championships, and then they can participate in the second World Cup as well. So this is a wish expressed particularly by Australia and New Zealand, and we're looking at that. It's just been confirmed that this multi-sport European Championships will take place in 2022 in Munich, 50 years after the Olympic Games of '72, and rowing have had to move the World Championships to be able to stay in this. We consider that for the sport of rowing to be a founding sport in this very successful event is key, but we also found out that European athletics decides the date. And it was a very difficult and uncomfortable number of meetings to try to settle this down, but it's going to be in August in 2022. So we are looking at how that can work for the non-European federations, providing them quality racing, 6 weeks to go and 9 weeks to go before the World Championships in Racice in 2022. So we'll be sending to you all this calendar and asking for your proposals. The other one is in 2024 with the games in Europe, whether you want the final FISA competitive event to be 6 or 7 weeks before the Olympic Games. We want your feedback on that so we can finally establish the break between the final FISA event and the Olympic regatta. So we imagine that the non-European federations will probably keep the teams in Europe, preparing for Paris 2024. But we'll be asking for your feedback about how to handle that. And we might adjust things in 2024 to make to suit your needs. So you'll be getting this in a mail to the national federations next week. You will have a presentation from Natalie Phillips, the rowing sport manager for Tokyo, also known as FISA Senior Event Manager, who will update you on the coaching items that we have been discussing with you in Linz and in Tokyo, and team management items. That will be later this morning. But just to say that, and Buchi, please put up your hand, and the Japanese Federation, thank you very much for a very successful test event, Buchi, and Dice and team. That's the venue. If you haven't been there, it's beautiful. That's the Tokyo Bay Bridge in the background. The construction work has been fantastic. Everything delivered on time and to a very high quality. And we just want to raise that there's a lot of noise at the start, and that's being worked on. Natalie will tell you more about that. There are airplanes every 2 minutes. Everyone's aware of that. And we have to probably have some 15-second delays, 20-second delays sometimes at the start so everyone can hear. You've heard about temperature. You've heard that the marathon and race walking was moved out of Tokyo. So we, of course, as usual, studied very carefully the temperatures, and our racing will start at 8:30 in the morning and conclude by noon. And we believe, according to our safety guidelines, that we are staying in the safe zone for the athletes of our sport. Horses have to stop at 10:30 because it gets too hot for them. So I don't know about Lawrence of Arabia and his horses, but anyway, so we believe, due with the temperature issue, we will be fine between 8:30 and 12. Spectators will have to be waking up quite early, and athletes as well. So you'll hear more from Natalie on specific issues. We'll also have a presentation to the National Federations Conference from Natalie on more federation level issues. Okay, JC, back to you.
Thank you, Matt. I'm conscious about the time, so I'll try to make the final 2 items quite brief. Just to say that recently in Katowice was held the World Anti-Doping Conference with quite interesting debates. I will not go into details, but just to say that the world of sport obviously is experiencing challenges in that dimension of anti-doping, and the good things to see it is that it's always I would say more and more complicated and difficult for the cheaters, and but the downside of it is it's also complicated for the non-cheaters to comply with all the rules. So I will not say more about this, just to say that the Olympic movement and the IOC will continue to invest in research, to invest in all the dimension regarding anti-doping. New, I would say, technology is coming. We are now talking about new genetic sequencing method. We are talking about DSB, dried blood sample. So, I mean, things are improving. One thing I would like to mention, and it was also the opportunity to adopt, and the foundation board of WADA has adopted the new code. So you will know that we were under the 2015 code. From 1st of Jan 2021, we will start with the new code, World Anti-Doping. My point here is just to mention you that it's not only about the code. We are talking about the code, and all these documents are known as international standards. And you have on testing and investigation, the one you probably know the most, the prohibited list, but there are also on education, on protection, on privacy and personal information, result management, laboratory, code compliance by laboratories, a new one, and TUE, and this one also you may know. So at the end of the day, just to mention that it makes all these things quite complex. I believe that all these documents means almost 500 pages. So you have really to be very expert to understand how it works. And what this is the, I would say, the consequence of being very strict and moving ahead to be sure that we can fight against doping with the appropriate tools, but at the end it makes all these things very complex, and you, as part of the world of sport, you are impacted by all these things. You have to know, you have to comply with this. And just to mention that as a signatory of the WADA code, we, FISA, as organizing an ADO, anti-doping organization, we have been audited by WADA. So it was, I would say that a quite challenging time for us. Obviously, not because of our spirit, our positioning in terms of fighting against doping, and I don't want to make it long, but you all know about our history. We have been at the leadership of this fight against doping. I will not recall in our rules we had a ban life. For anti-doping rule violation before we had to adopt to the code. First federation to adopt out of competition blood testing, etc., etc. No needle policy, another illustration. So FISA has always been in front of this fight against doping, and this is really, I would say, acknowledged by the experts and the organization in anti-doping. But that said, it's not about the spirit, it's not about how we, but it's also now, it has moved to a much more complex administrative environment, and the result of the audit, also it was, I would say, complimenting FISA for the spirit and for what we've been doing. We have also been very much challenged on I would say, more administrative aspects, that we were not in full compliance with the requirements, and it's more about administrative part. And this is, I would like to mention, because we have worked a lot, and we had to review a little bit of our organization. And one thing is for sure, it has the consequences of that is that the budget, the resources we have to put on anti-doping has just tremendously increased. It's not only about having a budget for testing, it's now having a budget for all the dimensions. And just to mention a few, we have been challenged on education. Are your athletes educated? Not only the athletes, the coaches, the entourage. They have to know about all these things, and we'll have to have another, I would say, commitment form from the athletes, because our was not appropriate in terms of engaging the athletes into having their data and the privacy engaged. So it's a lot of administrative task, a lot of resources, time. We do have fantastic staff who are working on it, but it's not only about that. It's all about the organization, and we have to cope with that. We have to improve and to make sure that we are fully compliant with with all these requirements and with all these expectations. Another point I would like to mention very briefly, we have now signed with the CAS ADD, which has been implemented by ICAS, so that now we have, even in the first hearing, has been moved from FISA to this totally independent structure led by ICAS. So basically, when we have an anti-doping rule violation, even at the first instance, it's not dealt with by FISA now, but by the CAS ADD, and actually it will be dedicated arbitrators. It will be one sole arbitrator dealing with the case, unless it is requested to have a three arbitrator panel. So we have signed for it, and we have moved to it, and it's important that you know in these aspects. Last but not least, and then I will open for discussion. I will not, again, make it very long. You know about that safeguarding is one of the top priority on our top priority list. And you know, this is our website. You know that we have been adopting a policy. The Council has voted for a policy and procedure. We have even safeguarding officer at each of the events since this year. And it's all about education. But these items have been shared with you, with the coaches in the conference, and there will be a specific session with the National Federation Conference this morning, so I will not go into details. Just to say that we have some changes in the statutes so that we can include several aspects, such as that we have a recognition of the mutual sanctions. If someone is sanctioned in one federation, it has to apply for every federation, so it has to be mutually recognized. It's not because you are sanctioned somewhere, then you can jump in another country and be safe. And we know that you know that also it's your responsibility in the National Federation to take safeguarding. But we, as FISA, because we have worked on it, we are also we can help you and share with you tools and best practices. So this is what I would we wanted, Matt and myself, to share with you this morning. Sorry it was a little bit quick, and I hope it was useful for you. Obviously, some will have had a lot of information, and some certainly a little bit less, because there are not only new aspects in this presentation. Now Matt and myself are happy to answer any question or comment you may have. We have a couple of minutes to do so. Don't be shy.
Jean-Christophe, thank you for your presentation today. Are there any sort of key learning points from the beach sprints approach that you think could benefit the flatwater events? So thinking specifically around sports presentations, spectator engagement.
Yeah, could you repeat the question for non-English speaking mother tongue, please?
Are there any...
With a French accent would be good.
Are there any key learning points from the beach sprints approach that could benefit flatwater events? So I was thinking specifically around sort of sports presentation, spectator engagement.
Yeah, good point. Actually, as you know, it's very important that we have the most attractive event and product, not only for the athletes, but also for the spectators, for the TV spectators, for the broadcasters. So, and that's why this product is being improved and developed. And Matt was in Shenzhen as an example to ensure that we can learn and make this event the more attractive. Now, to your point, obviously, if there are some aspects that we can move and learn from one discipline to another, fair enough, very good. I mean, I believe that we have to consider these disciplines like different disciplines in terms of regulation rules. I would say that we have to not to make a kind of replication. Let's say we mentioned this, the rules in coastal should not have, we don't have to have the same spirit in terms of rule in coastal than we do have in Olympic flat water style, about interference, etc. So I have, to answer your point, I would say yes, we have to ensure that each discipline is quite unique in a sense that it's not a replica, but if we can learn from one to another, fair enough, and it's always good to improve. And as I can, and Matt can be a little bit more detailed on that, but if you can look at our product or our events in the past years, it has, in terms of presentation, in terms of attractiveness for TV, for spectators, it has improved a lot, and this is a trend for the future. Whatever can be improved has to be improved.
Gianni Postiglione.
What's your name?
About safeguarding. About safeguarding. FISA will invite federations to have same rules in all countries, is right?
Sorry, it's very difficult to hear because the
okay.
I don't have the. Yes, I'm behind the speaker.
Okay,
actually.
Can you hear me now?
I have to move a little bit. What's your question?
About safeguarding.
Yes.
I said the rules, to apply the rules generally in FISA, we need that all nations, they have the same rules. Or because some rules, because you said one person that he has no good behavior in one place cannot go around. So this means that all countries, they should have the same rules.
Yeah, so I don't want to go very much into details. You will have session on this, but basically, just to make it short, obviously we cannot regulate and have each country will have its own rule, own law. So we cannot interfere with that. What we say is, first of all, it's about education, awareness, and just a mutual recognition. So that's what we can. I mean, we have to remain on our territory. We cannot regulate something that we don't have the legitimacy to do so. So, but again, this is something that we have to work on, and you will have more. I would say details with our experts, which I'm not on this, and I have an expert in the room.
Jean-Christophe, thank you very much for the presentation and the ongoing updates throughout the year. I do have a quick question. We've talked a lot about the Olympic program, but we haven't heard much about the Paralympic program. And just wondering, what are the plans there, and what might be the changes?
Thank you for the question. A very good question. Actually, we did not speak about Paralympic program because, I mean, the context is slightly different. And we are not in the same kind of pressure. Also, we are evaluated, and we have. They have also. IPC has also its own rules and evaluation to be part of the Paralympic. News is that we have been confirmed for the next Paralympic Games. It's still obviously it's a discipline we would like to continue to develop and to ensure that we have the necessary level to be part of the Paralympic Games. Still on track. So it's not because it was not mentioned today that we are not that this is not also a key priority for us.
Okay, sorry. Question? I'm here. Okay, question. Regarding the proposal to IOC for the coastal rowing, which are the decisions or the ideas to propose the beach sprint, the standard coastal rowing, or the classic coastal rowing, or both?
Very good question. At this stage, I will be very clear. It's open. the discussion we're having with the IOC, we have presented the different format, and we don't want to close the door. And why? One of the reasons is the key argument is we will use an existing venue. Is the venue with the harbor for the sailing, for example, sometimes they have a beach, sometimes they have not. So our position is say, okay, we are flexible enough, we have to adapt. So at this stage again, and it has to be very clear, there is no of these two formats, beach sprint or, I don't know, the name, endurance, or we don't have a clear position as regards to what will be the proposal to the IOC. It's open and it will be adapted depending on our future strategy, depending on the Olympic Games. We are in discussion with Paris 2024. We do know the sailing venue, so we know the layout, and actually both formats could apply. We are in discussion with LA 2028. There is a beach as well, fantastic. So actually, at this point in time, flexible, open, and no, we don't want to close any doors.
Yes, so thank you, Roland. With lightweight rowing basically moving out of the Olympic rowing events, what is FISA's strategy to keep lightweight rowing alive? Otherwise, if we do nothing, it probably will follow a kind of natural death process, and we get fewer and fewer events, and there's not a lot of guidance for the countries to focus on. Yeah,
when we say FISA strategy, it's our strategy, but because you, the National Federation, are totally in that exercise. So, as Matt has mentioned, we are reviewing the program every 4 years. We do know how important it is, how important lightweight is for our sport. I can tell you that apart from the Olympic Games program itself, for the World Championship, we do have we have in hands what we want to do with the lightweight. For all the, I would say, continental multi-sport organization, and I will refer to the Asian Games, they do have lightweight rowing. Fantastic. This is not the end of lightweight. This is the end of lightweight in the Olympic program. That said, I fully understand there will be a kind of impact, because national federations, you will invest, you get the subsidies when it's an Olympic event. But it's up to us, it's up to you to say, okay, we will continue to send a lightweight crew should the event be on the program. And then the program in the World Championship, it's made by us. So again, we have to work on what do we want for the future. At this point in time, you know the consequences in the program that has the decision on the lightweight men's 4. But again, it's up to the national federation to collectively continue to invest in the lightweight. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day, and see you tonight for the awards.
Okay. Thank you very much. For those coming back for the coaches conference, we will start at 20 past, not at quarter past, so you've got time to get some coffee. The National Federation, as I said, is out the door and to your right. And if you are going to the Tracy Muir workshop, it's in the endurance room, which is across from here. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. Rosie, the code's there outside. The code's outside there, okay. Okay, good morning, everyone. Our next session, we return on a topic that raised a long discussion last year to speak about the physiological aspects of altitude training. We invite Ida Svendsen, PhD in endurance training and immunity system, and physiologist from the Norway Olympic Committee. So please welcome to Ida.
Thank you. So my name is Ida Svendsen. I work as a physiologist for the Norwegian Olympic Committee. So I work with rowing, but I also work with quite a few other endurance sports, including cross-country skiing, triathlon, cycling, swimming. So I'm going to start just by giving a little bit of background and explain some of the physiology behind why athletes use altitude training. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Norwegian model and how, from my perspective, altitude training can be applied in rowing. So the interest for altitude training in the sporting world really started in 1968 with the Mexico Olympic Games. What happened there was that world and Olympic records were set in a lot of the sprints and the jumps and the throws events because of the reduced air resistance. But in the endurance events, most of the favourites performed surprisingly poorly, and almost all of the medals were won by high altitude natives, so people who lived and trained at altitude normally. So this sparked a real interest in the sporting community, both in terms of what can you do to improve performance when competing at altitude, and how can we use altitude to improve performance at sea level. So there's two different types of hypoxia. The one you find when you go up a mountain, so naturally, that's hyperbaric hypoxia. So hypo means low, hypobaric, low pressure, low oxygen. This second type is normobaric hypoxia. So that's where you have a normal air pressure, and this is typically what you find in altitude tents and altitude chambers. Here, you manipulate the air content, so you increase the proportion of nitrogen and you decrease the proportion of oxygen. So both give a similar physiological effect, but they're kind of two slightly different things in terms of both the physiology and how they're implemented. And in Norway, we actually are not allowed to use artificial altitude. I think we are the only country in the world where this is banned. So the only form of altitude training that our athletes and our coaches can use is the natural normobaric hypoxia that you find when you travel up a mountain. I know a lot of our athletes and coaches think that this is unfair, and I kind of agree with them in a lot of ways, but I think from a completely physiological perspective, I don't see it as too much of a problem. I think that a lot of the methods with the kind of altitude chambers and the altitude tents, I don't really believe that they have a substantial improvement on performance because of the hypoxic dose is perhaps a little bit too low. So I think in terms of improving sea level performance, I think actually the most effective method is still a kind of a live high model where you live at altitude and you train either at altitude or maybe at a slightly lower elevation. So in terms of altitude training models, there's quite a lot of different variations within these three models, but the three main ones are first live high, train high. So this is when an athlete lives at altitude and they also perform all of their training at altitude. The second model, live high, train low. The athlete lives at altitude, but they typically travel down to perform some of their sessions at a lower elevation or at sea level. And this is to try and preserve the kind of training intensity so that you can row or cycle or run at a speed and a technique that is relevant to what you're competing at. So to kind of preserve training quality while at the same time getting the physiological adaptations from living and spending a substantial proportion of the day at altitude. The third model, live low, train high. This is where the athlete lives at sea level, but they perform their training or some of their training either in a hypoxic chamber or perhaps with a hypoxic mask. And this is the model that is easiest to commercialize. So we have a lot of companies that are offering this, both in terms of gyms and altitude chambers. But this is also probably the one that has the least evidence that it has a significant effect on sea level performance. So the two models in green are the ones that, both from my experience and based on what the research says, I would say you can be pretty confident that these will have, if used correctly, a positive effect on hemoglobin mass and on exercise performance at sea level. The two in red, I personally don't think are that relevant in most cases. You can still use this. For example, we have the next Winter Olympics are going to be in Beijing, which is at an altitude of 1,800 meters. Obviously, in this kind of setting, where an athlete is going to be performing the most important competition of their 4-year cycle at altitude, then maybe a hypoxic chamber and being able to complete some sessions and looking at kind of pacing strategies and how the athlete responds, that might be useful. But typically, I would say that the first two models are the ones that have the most scientific backing, and from my experience working with athletes, are also the ones that the athletes respond to. So what happens when you go to altitude? If we just compare 2,000 meters, which is a kind of a pretty standard altitude that athletes will use, there's approximately 20% fewer oxygen molecules in every breath you take. And this means that VO2 max is substantially reduced. You can see from this graph here that the relationship between VO2 max and altitude is fairly linear. Obviously, there's some variation, and there's also quite a large inter-individual variation. So actually, athletes or persons who are better trained typically have a greater fall in VO2 max than untrained individuals. There's also genetic differences. This means that at 2,000 meters, there's about a 10 to 13% reduction in VO2 max. This means that if you're, for example, rowing at the same power output, you'll have higher ventilation, you'll have about 8 to 12 beats per minute higher heart rate, and you'll have higher blood lactate concentration than if you are doing the same workout at sea level. So all this helps to stimulate quite a few physiological adaptations that occur when you both live and train at altitude over a prolonged period of time. So one of the adaptations, and probably the most important in terms of improving endurance performance at sea level, is an increase in the hemoglobin mass. And this is triggered by oxygen desaturation, both at rest and during exercise at altitude. And this then stimulates the release of EPO from the kidneys. And this again stimulates the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow. And what we typically see is to see a significant increase in red blood cell mass and hemoglobin mass. An athlete would need to live at altitude for at least, we do see some increases after 2 weeks, but we see more substantial increases after 3 weeks. So typically, if the aim of the altitude training camp is to increase hemoglobin mass, we recommend a minimum of 3 weeks. There's also some other adaptations, the ventilatory adaptations. So this is in terms of breathing rate and kind of the respiratory parameters. These happen quite quickly. So these can occur within the first few days at altitude, even within the first few hours. So in terms of improving performance at altitude, these adaptations occur a lot more rapidly, but have limited value when you come back down to sea level. We also see an increase in the myoglobin mass in the muscles. So the hemoglobin mass in the blood, that helps your blood to take the oxygen from the lungs and transport it to your muscles. And then the myoglobin, increase in myoglobin mass, helps your muscles to actually take up that oxygen and to use it. And the final adaptation is an improvement in the buffering capacity in the blood. So this means that your athlete is better able to maintain a sensible kind of pH in the blood, even at high blood lactate levels. So I know that there was a talk about altitude training last year that Karsten Lundby was talking about, and if you look at the scientific literature around altitude training and the effect on hemoglobin mass, it can be quite equivocal. Some studies say it does improve hemoglobin mass, some studies say it doesn't. I think the problem with a lot of the scientific literature is that scientists are they spend a lot of time trying to control both the conditions. So if they have a control group and an altitude group, the sea level group, the control group, will have to train exactly the same as the altitude group. And personally, I don't have any athletes that train the same altitude as they do when they're at sea level. All of our athletes will train differently at altitude than they do at sea level. So I think that's part of the explanation why when you see very well-controlled scientific studies that are matched for training intensity and training volume, then maybe you don't see a significant influence on hemoglobin mass. So this is just a graph that shows hemoglobin mass change in our athletes in the sports that I've worked with and we've got measurements from. So the blue bars are the average response in the different sports, and the black dots are the variation. So each black dot is an individual response. So as you can see, actually rowing is over here. There's quite a large variation, and it's also we see there is a significant improvement, around 3.2%, which is in line with kind of what a lot of the studies in the literature will say that do find a positive response. And you see that some of the sports actually have quite substantially larger improvement in hemoglobin mass. For example, triathlon and swimming appear to respond really well. I think one of the explanations for the fact that maybe rowing looks like they come out a little bit worse in this graph is that rowers have a really high baseline hemoglobin mass. So this has something to do with body size. Obviously, if you're 2 meters tall and you're a large person, you have more blood. But I think it also has to do with the kind of training you do, and we also see high absolute VO2 max volumes, VO2 max values in rowers. And we do know that if you have a high baseline hemoglobin mass, it is more difficult to get an increase at altitude. So if you're already really well developed in this characteristic, if you have an athlete that has a baseline very high hemoglobin mass, they may not respond quite as well at altitude. Whereas if you have an athlete whose hemoglobin mass is lower, they might see a really big response at altitude. So I think there'll be some questions and answers with Johan, and I'm sure he will go a little bit more into detail about how the Norwegians use altitude training, but I'll just go through kind of the model that they've been using the last few years. They typically have 2 to 3 altitude camps, each of about 3 weeks duration. So the first one is in the autumn in Sierra Nevada. It's a live high, kind of train low model. They live at 2,300 meters, and they will do some of their training at 2,300 meters, maybe even some training a little bit higher, with hiking and cycling. And then all of the rowing will happen at about 900 meters on the lake. So rowing is probably one of our sports that uses the live high, train low model more than any of our other sports because of the need to actually have the facilities to be able to row on water. And it's not always possible to find a lake at 2,000 meters. Most of our other sports use a live high, train high, or train higher strategy, where they do most of their training at the living elevation or even a little bit above. The second camp is a winter camp. This is kind of a general endurance training camp. It's a lot of cross-country skiing, some rowing ergometer, and this is a live high, train high camp. So they both live and train at about 1,900 to 2,000 meters above sea level. And the final one, this is, not all of our boats and athletes use this camp, but this is kind of a pre-competition camp, and it's, again, in Livigno, and live high, train high. They live at 2,000 meters, and they row at the lake that's a little bit lower, but not very low. So this is just an example of hemoglobin mass changes for these training camps in one of our athletes. So what we see, like we said, is that the camps where he has a lower hemoglobin mass, when he goes into the training camp, he actually sees quite a large increase. What we see is that the summer camp before the World Championships, he actually goes into the training camp with a really high baseline hemoglobin mass, and therefore he doesn't really see much of a response. And likely this is because this athlete has already almost maxed out his potential for hemoglobin mass. I think when he's at about up towards 1,300 grams, he probably has a limited capacity to improve this any further. And that is not to say that this camp here is not useful. There are other physiological adaptations that occur at altitude, and there are also other benefits of training at altitude other than the pure kind of classical physiological ones that you read about in the scientific literature. For example, I find that training at altitude is a really good way of kind of naturally periodizing the training so that you get a block of training that prioritizes aerobic capacity, and maybe what you get when you're at altitude is you get a really good stimulus of the cardiovascular system while maybe resting the muscles a little bit, because you can you can train at a slightly lower absolute intensity and still get the same adaptation in terms of the cardiovascular system. But it is at least worth kind of thinking about, and this is obviously complicated further when you have a boat with 4 athletes, and maybe you have 2 athletes that typically respond really well and 2 athletes that don't feel they respond as well to altitude. It does complicate things when you're in a team sport where you have more than 1 athlete to kind of think about. So I'll talk a little bit. This is basically based on the Norwegian model, but we have a kind of a very traditional model for training at altitude that all of our sports use. So we have a low intensity, high volume model, and that's pretty much the same regardless of what time of year the athletes are at altitude. Typically, if it's kind of in the competition season, they might live and train a little bit lower to try and maintain kind of the intensity a little bit more and use more of a live high, train low model. But typically, they're always there, and it's always relatively low intensity. We have a 5-zone kind of heart rate zone scale that we use to define training, and when they're at altitude, they're never really above zone 3 or zone 4. And what we've seen is that when athletes have tried to incorporate more high-intensity training, we typically see that this has a negative effect on their hemoglobin mass response. So it looks like that might actually impair the body's capacity to produce new red blood cells. And I guess this seems quite logical because the body needs to have, if you're constantly breaking the body down with hard, tough training sessions, then it doesn't have enough time to, well, it's spending all its energy rebuilding and recovering rather than actually making new red blood cells and increasing the volume. So we typically have no anaerobic endurance training, nothing with really high blood lactate levels. And most of our athletes do some strength training at altitude, but typically with fewer sets or fewer reps per set and longer recoveries. And I would always advise my athletes to avoid new exercises that cause substantial muscle damage or muscle soreness. Because actually when you get any kind of inflammation, whether it's systemic or whether it's in the muscles, this reduces EPO and will impair the hemoglobin mass response. So in my opinion, if you're at altitude, aerobic capacity should always be priority number 1. You're not at altitude to get stronger or more explosive. You're at altitude to improve aerobic capacity and VO2 max. In terms of injury and infection, I would say in almost all cases, if an athlete is sick, they shouldn't be at altitude. Firstly, like we talked about, inflammation reduces the red blood cell response and the hemoglobin mass response. So I think I have yet to see an athlete that has been sick at altitude, even just with a cold, that comes home and has a good response in hemoglobin mass. Secondly, being at altitude actually usually, or at least anecdotally, it will take longer for the athletes to get well. They will just be sick for longer than if you send them home and let them recover. So I would always say if an athlete is sick, they don't travel to altitude. If an athlete gets sick while at altitude, I would certainly isolate them from the rest of the team. But I would typically also, unless it's just like a bit of a blocked nose, I would also advise to send them home. And if you read the literature, there's actually quite a lot of indication that you get a greater stress hormone response at altitude. And what this means is that when you train, stress hormones are released into the bloodstream, including something called cortisol. And when you're at altitude, more cortisol is released for the same training session as at sea level. And what cortisol does is it reduces the immune response. So at altitude, your athletes will typically be a little bit immunosuppressed. They will have a slightly lower capacity to fight viruses and bacteria than they would at sea level. However, at altitude, your athletes are also typically exposed to fewer viruses and bacteria. You're in a much more controlled environment, at least with our teams. Our athletes only really interact with the athletes on the team and the coaches and the support staff. While at home, they might go to the cinema, they'll sit on the train, they'll be around a lot of people coughing and who are sick. So typically, we don't actually see that our athletes are more frequently sick at altitude than they are at sea level. But if they were exposed to a virus or a bacteria, then they would be slightly less able to fight it off than what they would be at sea level. So it's important to take this into account. Always make sure that you have good routines in terms of hygiene, nutrition and sleep, and all the other things that we know are important for kind of avoiding illness. So sleep and recovery. We also know that typically it takes a little bit longer for athletes to recover when they're at altitude compared to at sea level. And at the same time, you get reduced sleep quality. This is quite individual, but most athletes will sleep a little bit worse at altitude than they do at home. And this is a mixture of the hypoxia and the fact that maybe they're in a hotel with a slightly uncomfortable bed and uncomfortable pillows, and it's a different place than what they're used to. But we see that this is particularly notable the first week when they're not well acclimatized to the altitude, and if you're at very high elevations. So we've experimented a little bit with having athletes living, particularly in cross-country skiing, we've experimented with having athletes living a lot higher than we would usually have. So they would live at maybe 3,200 meters to try and get kind of an increase in the EPO response and their red blood cell response. And what we see is that the athletes, they don't sleep and they typically get sick. So even though you might get if you manage to get them through it and they stay healthy, then you probably would get a good response. We see that the risk is actually quite high with trying to do something like that. And it's important to, as coaches, to take this into account. If you know that your athletes are sleeping worse than they would at home, then maybe don't have your first training session at 7 a.m. Maybe move it a little bit later so that the athletes can compensate for having been awake a few times during the night by having a bit of a lie-in. So I would always recommend that training in meal times kind of reflect the fact that the athletes need a little bit more time in bed than they would at home. Finally, nutrition and hydration. We know that it's important for athletes to be in energy balance when they're at altitude. I know in some sports, in cycling and a few others, that athletes from other nations use altitude as a method to lose weight because your resting metabolism is actually increased at altitude. If the aim of the camp is to get a good improvement in hemoglobin mass and kind of aerobic capacity, I would say that you should not be losing weight while at altitude. We often see that athletes that go down more than maybe 1 or 1.5 kilos, they have a very poor hemoglobin mass response. And this can be challenging for athletes because you have the increase in resting metabolism. You also typically maybe train more, a greater volume at altitude than you do at home, and your appetite is often reduced. So eating enough can actually be quite challenging for a lot of athletes when they're at altitude, particularly if you're a place where the food is a little bit boring and there's not much variation. And it obviously also, in terms of lightweight rowers, this can be a problem. So I think if you're working with lightweight rowers, you should consider the timing of the altitude training camps. I think having an athlete at altitude when they're trying to lose weight is probably not a very good idea, both because they won't get much of a response in hemoglobin, but because you're actually at a very risky part of the season in terms of illness already, and sending them to altitude is only really going to make that worse. Iron status, a really important one. If you don't have enough iron, your body can't make any new red blood cells. So you should always have your athletes check their iron status before they go to altitude, and then long enough in advance that you can actually supplement if they are deficient. So it's no use finding out 1 week into the training camp and getting the answers or the results from a blood test saying that you're iron deficient. At that point, it's kind of too late. So you need to do this 2 to 3 weeks in advance. The final one is hydration. There's increased fluid loss at altitude. There's increased urination, and there's also, because you're breathing more, you're actually losing more fluid via ventilation. And in addition, there's typically really low humidity in the air at altitude, which again causes increased fluid loss. So there's an increased need for hydration at altitude. Being dehydrated, it will both increase the cortisol response, and again, this will increase infection risk at altitude. So this one's an important one in terms of kind of staying healthy. So a quick summary. There's quite a number of different physiological mechanisms that occur at altitude. Hemoglobin mass is probably the most important, but there are other adaptations. The individual response is influenced by baseline value and the hypoxic dose. So you will get a small increase, perhaps, if the athlete is there for 2 weeks. You will get a much larger increase if the athlete is there for 3 weeks. And the same, the higher you are, the greater the kind of stimulus for EPO release, but there are also risks involved with living and training too high. I would say that live high, train high, and live high, train low are both models that can be used effectively, and I think we have a lot of experience that these two models are beneficial for performance at sea level, even if the kind of research evidence is a little bit equivocal. And even without an increase in hemoglobin mass, altitude training can still have a positive effect on performance via other mechanisms. So if you have an athlete that doesn't see an improvement in hemoglobin mass, then it's important to kind of consider that they may have had other adaptations or other training responses that might still be important. Thank you.
Okay, to bring the discussion to the coach view, we invite two very experienced coaches to join Ida for the next panel. Johan Flodin, successful coach from Sweden, and Mr. Jürgen Groblen from Sweden, and now the head coach for Norway. And Jürgen Groblen, who over the last decades has masterminded the British rowing and have a book on Amazon, so you can find everything.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for your presentation. I think I might come around the other side, so I'm not quite near the... I'm not behind the podium. Okay, so we've heard a little bit about, Johan, how you use altitude training. So can you just take us through a little bit more detail in terms of you mentioned the timings, but can you just talk about sort of when in the season you go? Is it right at the beginning of the autumn season? Is it a bit later? How long do you stay up there? And so let's start with that, and then we can talk about the type of training you do up there. Please. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We start our altitude year with actually a common camp together with triathlon, swimming, and cycling. And some race walkers up in Sierra Nevada, and we do that somewhere October, November, a little bit different from each year, and then we have a cross-country ski camp in Livigno in the middle of January to the beginning of February, and then we send up the crews that has highest belief on altitude training to Livigno again, and prior to the World Championships. And we have the idea that we coming down 24 days before the most important race of the championship.
Okay, so when you say 24 days, you mean the final?
Usually for Olaf it has been the final, but in this year he's in the quad, and we think that the road to final is not that easy as it was in 2004. So I think that this year we will actually aiming for the beginning of the regatta, 24th of July.
Okay.
And we're staying for somewhere between 18 and 21 days at each time.
Okay, thank you. And how many years have you been using altitude training for?
I used it when I was coaching Frida before, so I think I've been using altitude training for about 10 years. And that then, in the beginning, actually, we could hang on to the Norwegian team. So Olaf has used altitude training, I think, since, and Norway has used it for 40 years, I think, especially on ski camps. And they were in St. Moritz before, so it's a long tradition with using altitude training, and Olaf has done it. He needs to do it. He's one of the great responders as well.
Okay, thank you. Jürgen, so I'll start with how many years have you been taking rowers up to altitude?
Okay, and that would say something about my age, if you ask me. I know with high altitude I've been involved as a student in preparation of the '68 Olympics in Mexico. So in that time, I think, we experiment, okay, how can we adapt to high altitude as a student? We have been running around with normal masks and putting a tube on to have, less oxygen. That was very demanding on the body, very strong. But then I think since I'm a coach, that was started in 1970, I'm going to high altitude. I think I've been more than 100 camps. Excludes time we spent also an experiment with a chamber. So I think normally all my life as a coach I've been to high altitude.
Okay, so Johan explained how and when he uses altitude training. So how do you use it with your athletes?
I think we have more or less a similar model. We go 3 times in high altitude. We go in November, December, depends on our regatta calendar in Britain, especially with the foreset. So we're adapting a little bit to that. Then we go again in January. Both camps are cross camps, so it's not rowing, because you can't row in the winter. And then we have in the final preparation before the World Championships, Olympic Games, similar high altitude camp. We prefer, or we have always sleep high, train high. So I think we've been always in combination with a venue where we train. We tried different things, we tried in the past, but I think there was always maybe the most efficient model, I think.
Okay, and typically are you up at altitude about 3 weeks as well each time?
I think in the old days we started with 3 weeks. Of course, then there's a financial thing as well. So we've been down to 16 days. And I think doing that more often, or now 3 times, my experience was managed my expectation on all the physiology effects as we just have seen from the Norwegians.
And I know that on occasions the two of you have crossed or been at Sierra Nevada at the same time. And Johan, you're living high, training low. And Jürgen, you're training high, living high. So can you just describe what sort of training that you would typically do in that period?
For us, it's also a kind of a general camp, but we also choose to row at least 6 mornings every week. So we're going down for 3 or 4 hours, 2,000 meter, and how I usually do a big volume of long, slow distance. We can do 30 kilometers on the lake in the morning, and then in the afternoon we can have a weight session or a cross training session with cycling and running and walking in the mountains or weight training. So that's a choice that we have done, because it also comes in a period when it starts to get really hard to row in Norway. So we want to it's important to us to keep that quality.
Yeah, I think, especially in Sierra Nevada, there's a chance to row, but I think with a big team like we are, it's a lot more difficult, big logistics, getting all the boats up there, get them boating, and so far we preferred to use the ergos in where we're living. We do weight training, do other activities like playing football or things like that, so be more athletic.
Okay, and I think for both of you, how do you prepare your athletes before you actually go up to altitude? So do you have anything that you do in the weeks, days leading into an altitude camp, or do you just go up there and you're there?
For us, we usually start up, when we know that we're going to an altitude camp, we start to work more intense with IDA. So we actually do measurements on hemoglobin volume or hemoglobin mass. We also do a pre-altitude medical investigation to see if people are prepared, if their immune system, is their iron depots filled up. And we also like to have what we call an easy enter and an easy exit. So actually we train a little bit less intense training the last 48 hours before we leave, and the first 3 days when we come up, and the same when we exit. So it's we feel that those around the travel are really demanding periods, because you want to come up fresh and you want to leave somewhat fresh. So yeah, we have a lot of preparation, and we, as Ida said, we're not if somebody is ill, we're not sending them, and we're also very quick on sending people home if they have some kind of infection. We also stimulate people to go to the dentist before, because if you have a bad tooth, that can also actually make the response worse.
And Jürgen?
I think similar. I think the message is really crystal clear. If you take an unfit athlete in high altitude and you think there's a fast track to make him fit, will not work. There will definitely a negative effect. So insofar, yeah, of course our athletes will be also checked. They are healthy. That's why I think also our preparation is, we have the first 8 weeks home training, so they are more or less fit when they go up. And I think then, yeah, a couple of days before we go, we have a little bit less training, so they recover, so we can really use high altitude training right from the beginning. We have also in the program, yeah, the first 3 days as an adaptation time, where we holding the training a little bit lower, but then I think we have the full training.
Okay, and do you modify, I mean, you've talked about, maybe this is also a question for you, Ida, you've talked about the individual responses being quite different. So how does that look when you have an athlete that's never been to altitude as opposed to someone that has been to altitude?
I think that is a really important question, because you have followed a lot of other teams, and we saw that response from the triathlon team, and they've been really a lot on altitude, and it seems like all of them have really good positive response.
I've got a mic. I don't think that's so much to do with kind of a physiological carryover. It's not that if you've been 5 years at altitude, I'm not sure it's kind of like a kind of muscle memory. I think it's more the fact that when you take an athlete up to altitude for the first time, they typically don't know quite what to do in terms of training intensity. It's difficult to get athletes to kind of hit the right intensity. You need to recalibrate your feeling against kind of heart rate and blood lactate. So I think the more experienced an athlete is, I think the better they are at all the things that actually contribute towards getting a good response. And I don't believe there's such a thing as a non-responder. I think everyone, if you put them high enough for long enough, everyone will respond as long as they're kind of doing things correctly. And I think the more you've been at altitude, the more likely it is that you do the correct things. So, and that's everything. It's not just training. It's sleeping right, it's eating right, it's drinking right, it's everything around it. And I think people are different, so maybe some people can train a little bit more intense at altitude, but I think you need to be at a few training camps before the athlete really understands what they should be doing. We obviously try to help them, but usually an athlete needs to experience it for themselves. It doesn't really help telling them always the first time. Some people listen, some people need to kind of make the mistakes themselves.
So what you're really saying is that going to altitude, maybe the second year is better because you know what to expect and what to feel, or how it will feel, rather than there's a non-response there.
I think so. I think the experience is important, and I think that's important to know as well when you go up with an athlete. The first time you take them up to altitude, a lot of our athletes some of them get a bit stressed because especially if you're doing it kind of close to the season, the competition season, they get up there and they're suddenly not hitting the kind of the speeds that they want to be running at or the power outputs they want to be rowing at, and they feel like their body isn't responding. I think having the kind of the safety and knowing, having done it before and knowing that this is how it feels, and I know that when I get to sea level, this will be good for me.
Jürgen, have you had similar experiences with new athletes?
Yes, I think, of course, like every other thing, you have to monitor those athletes going the first time. Is a big mental thing sometimes, I feel, for them, because it is different. You know, if they go upstairs, they're breathing a little bit harder. They will feel that already, and of course, coaches even more. So I think, and so far, it's good. Yeah, I wouldn't do it with the athlete in the last minute and okay, come to high altitude. It's always good to have some adaptation in camps before, so they have a little bit idea what's coming up. I think that's definitely a useful thing. We tried sometimes, but it's not practical as well. We have a chamber, but was not very practical with again with a big group. But we're starting and do a camp with the under 23s. So a lot of athletes coming then to the seniors had more or less some contact with high altitude. But otherwise, what I want to say, yeah, you shouldn't be so scared. Okay, you can kill athletes on sea level. I've seen that. And you have to look and take some principles, and they've been well shown here from the done, I think, is not a big problem.
I think the most common mistake that I see like new athletes make is that they don't kind of trust that they want to train too much and too hard when they're at altitude. I think I've never seen an athlete train too little at altitude. Almost always what I see is athletes who are, especially new athletes, who kind of feel like they're too nervous to take the training intensity down a little bit or the volume, to kind of trust that will be enough, so they push the boundaries a little bit too far. I very rarely see athletes who train too little at altitude, and that's why they didn't get a good response. It's almost always the other way around. It's too much and too hard.
Okay, so let's just move to the third camp of the year, because we've had 2 camps and we've got well-adjusted athletes with high hemoglobin levels. So how do you use that? You said, you've given us the date almost, you're going to be flying out of your training camp into Tokyo. So what do you do at that camp? Because both of you used that as a water camp, the last one. So what sort of training would you typically do there? Because we're obviously quite close to the World Championships and in race, getting ready for racing. So what do you do?
For next year, we will leave directly after the Europeans to go up. So we will actually start. We will have a few days of the recovery after the Europeans at altitude, and then we will do a lot of volume training, and we will use that base if there is a lot of anyway. We would like to have a minor cycle between the Europeans and the Olympic Games, so we'll have a lot of volume training in that camp, and we will use that extra hemoglobin mass and the volume training for the preparation in high intensity training at Årjungen at home. So we mainly use altitude to be better in the period before the championships, not exclusively bigger hemoglobin mass at the championships.
Okay, and Jürgen?
I think no difference. I would call it always as a work camp. I think the model is a little bit going through in shorter intervals what you do throughout the year. So that means you go to a higher volume of training, and to the end you slowly prepare for the competition. So there will be some elements of racing training in high altitude. So far, that's what we're doing. So it's still weight training, we carry on. So very simple, easy.
And obviously that's a critical part of the year, because you don't want anybody to get sick or ill. So presumably the monitoring is really important there, Ida. And what sort of parameters would you be looking out for to back off for the training or push on?
I think usually, I did my PhD. We did as part of my PhD, I did an overreaching study where we tried to take loads of blood samples and saliva samples and try to identify when an athlete was kind of on the edge of overreaching. And the conclusion after taking probably 50 different kind of measures is that how the athletes feel is almost always the best method. So we try and get our athletes to fill out training diaries, and by kind of monitoring the training load up against they fill out a kind of a 1 to 10 scale of like form. I think that's probably one of the most sensible ways, and talking to the athletes. And I think you can detect some things through blood samples, but almost always how the athlete feels is the most important thing. And like you say, it is a high risk period in terms of getting sick. So like our lightweight rowers won't go to altitude in that period because they're trying to lose weight and they're already at a kind of an increased risk. So we don't want to push that any further.
Okay. And just in terms of that, do you individualise your training a little bit more when you're up at those camps, or is it very much sort of everybody together because we need to get through this work camp?
Yeah, I think we have one training program, but as every training program is a group training, but of course there's always adapting to special needs of the athlete, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think definitely we have the same. We're going to send up a quad with Olaf and 3 really young guys. So we will bring singles and doubles to that camp as well. And we know that we need to individualize a lot. When Olaf and Kjetil was up there before the 2016 Olympics, I guess they were doing like 40% of the training in the double.
Okay, and that was just because of the responses you were seeing.
Yeah, and we use, of course, if people are having bad sleep or bad appetite, together with not feeling good at training, that is a good, strong indicator that you should have some extra rest. And we also use a lot of lactate blood samples to keep the intensity of the training low enough.
Okay, so we're nearly at the end of our time, but I think it would be useful to have some other questions, and I'm sure Gianni has got a question for you.
I already told Ida about you, Gianni. Maybe you need us.
No, she's got. I need your answer. It won't be my answer. So.
Okay. First of all, both of you, do you have experience on sea level? These first questions. So you are so used for altitude training and you are proud of this training and your results too. But you have never tried to make the final preparation on sea level. And what you observe between the two different preparations, if you have done it? It's for both for you and for Jürgen.
Yeah, before the 2013 Olympics, 2013 World Championships, when we got 2 golds in the light and the heavyweight double sculler, we prepared on sea level. So not every year we are doing altitude training, and this year, before the Olympics, we also have the lightweight double and Kjetil. Kjetil, he's always on high risk to get infections. So Kjetil and the lightweight double will prepare in Gaverate, and the quad and maybe Birgit will prepare. Birgit has a really good response from altitude training as well. Maybe those will prepare in Livigno. So we will have difference within the team, the boats that I coach.
Yeah, of course we have also always a plan B, and I remember in 1996 and 1995, because of the Olympics are so early, and the lakes are frozen in 2,000 meters. So we prepared on sea level for the Olympic Games, and I think this year or next year we have to be prepared as well. The lake we are going might be frozen, so far I think both is possible. Yeah, I don't see a big problem, but I believe in high altitude training for all different reasons.
The question for the physiologist, how long is the effect of altitude training? We don't listen.
It depends a little bit on the parameter that you're looking at. So if you're looking at the hemoglobin mass, then it will typically maybe last for a month, 3 weeks to 4 weeks. But obviously, like Johan was saying, when they use the pre-competition camp, they actually use that camp in order to be able to have a really good block of training, high-intensity training in the last period. So you're not using it just for that physiological adaptation after those 3 or 4 weeks and that's gone. You're actually using it so that you can train a little bit harder and a little bit better and have more quality in the training in the kind of the super compensation phase that they will be doing right before the championships. So I think it's very difficult to say that you come down from altitude and after this number of days the effect is gone, because hopefully you've actually used the effect to train better and then get another effect that you will use later. So.
Yeah, because there's a lot of controversial on this, because somebody says 7, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, now you are also 4 weeks. So I think it's 1 month for, in reality, for 12 days or 13 days of training. Because if you arrive in the first 3 days acclimatization, you have 3 days before of preparing the altitude, and then you have the training intensity. Before the end, you have other 3 days of you come down a little bit, and then you have other 3 days to adaptation on sea level. You can see that the real effective intensive training is quite small. And at the end, you have 1 week before, 1 week after, or we say 6 days, and 6 days where it's low intensity. We cannot speak more about polarized training, where you focus on volume before and on altitude, and then at the end you make mostly intensive training, because you create volume and then at the end intensity. So we can speak about polarized training. Is a scientific answer. Can you listen? Because before they don't listen.
I'm not sure what the question was, sorry.
The question is, can we speak that is polarized training, because they have a volume, a big aerobic volume, and not so big, because it's a few days, it's 12 days maybe, because we calculate 3 days of adaptation, 3 days of leaving the altitude, and then another 3 days when you arrive. So in reality, the real effective training is very small, it's not so big. And then after this, you go on intensity, is right, Johan?
Yes, and I definitely, to me, it's definitely polarized training, and it's a minor cycle. I mean, we have a program or an idea that is about 6 weeks. That so this starts about 6 weeks before the World Championships or the Olympic Games for next year. So definitely it's a cyclist with training, and I think it's really natural polarized. You can do a lot of volume when you're coming up. You can do some more intensive work in the second part of the camp, and then you have a little bit more volume when you're traveling down and coming home, and then you can start to intensity training as well. So I think it's a very classical tapering. If you look at Igor Mjuka's studies, it's a typical tapering period.
Jürgen, for you?
Yeah, I think no difference to what the Norwegians doing. Yeah, you need 3 to 4 days readaptation to sea level. I think that, but you still train in a lower intensity. You will see sometime, okay, athletes and in other sports as well, different models, people coming straight down, track and field, for example, coming straight down and compete, European Championships or World Championships. So there's all different models, but we have more or less the same model. This is a work camp, and then we're going towards the preparation of the racing time to the Worlds or to the Olympic Games, and using those 14 days afterwards, plus on the traveling day, the time on the venue to prepare for the racing.
Last. In Tokyo, you will have the altitude, we say the altitude effect, but you will have temperature acclimatization and the jet lag. So can you combine all these 3 things with altitude? Last question, sorry. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have a plan for that.
Okay. Right, well, thank you very much. Jürgen and Johan are still around, so if you have some questions for them, and Ida as well. So if you have some questions for them, I'm sure they would be very happy to answer your queries. So I'd like to thank them very much for their very honest and open telling to us about how and why they use altitude training. So thank you very much indeed.
I think that was a good compensation for last year.
Okay. Please attention. Very interesting panel discussion about important subject. Now we are 8 months before the start of Olympic Games 2020 in Tokyo, and any information about Tokyo, any information about rowing venue, any information about weather during the games is very significant. Natalie Phillips, Tokyo 2020 rowing sport manager, will give us information about Tokyo, and right after Henk-Jan Svolle will inform us about the weather during the games. I'll leave floor now to Natalie, and right after to Henk-Jan Svolle.
Thank you, Nebojša. Good morning, nice to see so many of you here. I'm Natalie, rowing sports manager for Tokyo 2020, and would like to also take the opportunity to introduce two members of my team, Lotte, who is the rowing services manager, and John, who is our technical consultant. So I would like to take this opportunity to run through a few updates from our side in the preparation of the games, which are not so far away. So to start, just an update, reminder of the dates. The Olympic Village opens on the 14th of July, which is the same date as the rowing venue. So from 12 o'clock on the 14th of July, you can access the venue for the boats and with your athletes. The draw will take place on the 22nd. The opening ceremony on the 24th of July, so that is the same day as our first competition. And our competition will run till the 31st, and we have a spare day on the 1st of August, which we hope we will not use. Closing ceremony on the 9th of August. For the Paralympic Games, the village will open on the 18th of August, and it's the same for the rowing venue. From 12 o'clock on the 18th, you will be able to access the boats and to use the facilities at the venue. The opening ceremony is the 25th of August, and the first day of competition, 26. We also have a reserve day on the 31st of August, and the closing ceremony will be on the 6th of September. Here are the training times, or training day opening of the venue, and of opening of the course, as well as racing days. So on training days, the venue will open at 7, and the course at 7:30. On racing days, it's slightly earlier. We will open the venue at 6, and the course at 6:15. On both training and racing days, we'll close the course at 7 and the venue 7:30. So the last bus departing the venue to the village is 7:30. Just one point to highlight is we are sharing the venue with Canoe Sprint, and we need to allow them to have a time on the field of play, on the course, for them to train. So only on racing days in the afternoon between 2 and 5, the course will be closed for rowing to allow access to our canoeing friends to train on the course. For the Paralympics, it's very similar. We will open the course at 7 and the venue, open the venue at 7 and the course at 7:30 on training days. And then on racing days, we open 15 minutes earlier at 7:15. The closing time of the venue is 1 hour earlier than the Olympics, and this is because of sunset. Sunset is earlier towards the end of August. However, there is one difference. During para-training times, the canoeist will be able to train on the warm-up, cool-down area. So we will have rowing on the main course and canoeing on the warm-up cool-down area. On racing days, we will have a dedicated time for the canoeists, which is from 2 to 4. So the rowing course is closed for rowing during that time. One point I wanted to mention on the Olympics is on day 0, which is the day of the opening ceremony and the first racing day. We have to close the venue slightly earlier because of the opening ceremony taking place. So the last bus leaving the venue will be 5 o'clock. Here there's a layout of the facilities. Just to explain again for those who are not aware, we have a dam. The course is dammed either side, so there's no flow of water. The water it's salt. And along the course we have a TV road, so we'll have the TV cars going up and down during racing. We have wave absorbers all along the edge of the courses, as well as between the warm-up, cool-down, and the racing lanes. We will have grandstands on both sides of the course. On the finish tower of the course, it will be for spectators with tickets category A and C, and opposite side, spectators category B. And then, of course, the finish tower, boathouse area, the pontoons, as you can see in the image. An update on some of the facilities and services at the venue. So all non-accredited vehicles will be able to access up until approximately 1,300 meters from the boathouse area. For vehicles that have accreditation, VAPs, you'll be able to get closer, so approximately 300 meters from the boathouse. And for athletes coming directly from the Paralympic Village, they'll be dropped very close to the boathouse area, approximately 50 meters, which is at the back of the grandstand. The driving time from the village to the venue is still to be confirmed, but is estimated at this moment 30 minutes. We will have spaces for the athletes, so a big lounge, athlete lounge, which is air conditioned. Then there will be also smaller rooms that will be allocated based on the size of the team. These are also air conditioned. So once we have the final entries of number of countries participating in the Olympics and Paralympics, these will be allocated. Then in addition, there's team tents, which we are restricted on the number. We do have only space for 26, so we'll be sending out a questionnaire to teams to request if you're planning on bringing a team tent to Tokyo or not. And as well, the same with ice baths. Currently, the provision is to limit one ice bath per team, but we would need more feedback also from you to understand what you're looking for and then how we allocate the space. There's a big ergometer bike room, and we will have 16 bikes and 30 ergometers. It will be Concept 2 and RP3 ergometers. And some of you have asked, the RP3s will have monitors. The athletes will be able to watch the competition from the grandstand. There will be a dedicated space in the grandstand for teams. Coaches will be able to cycle along the course during training. However, it's not possible to cycle along the TV road during racing. There will be a dedicated car, a van, that will follow each race with 6 seats. And so one coach per team in that race will be entitled to follow the race and be in that van. There is a bike rental service available at the venue as well. For ice, the provision is for 3 kilos of cubed ice and 1 kilo of crushed ice per athlete per day. So that will be available for the teams. Also at the venue, there will be the option of second breakfast as well as lunch, and these will be hot meals. Regarding what food can be brought into the venue, we're still waiting for the IOC to confirm to us, and as soon as we have that information, we will share it with you. A little bit on the rate card. So you should have, through your national federations, received this information from the national Olympic committees. If you haven't, please contact them. There is a general rate card, and you need to request any items from that rate card by the 20th of December. Then until the 19th of January, there is a period where you can't request any additional items, but then it will open for a second phase later in January. Any rowing specific items that your team would like to request, whether it's a freezer, slushy machine, ice bath, and for Tokyo, to rent it through Tokyo 2020, please contact your National Olympic Committees, National Paralympic Committees to put that order through so that Tokyo 2020 can start the process on their end. Now to the freight support plan. I know that many of you are waiting for this information. So we have 2 hubs, and the 2 hubs are Philippi and Empaha workshops. So it will be the responsibility of the national federations to deliver the boats to these 2 hubs. Then from the hubs, Tokyo 2020 will take on the responsibility until the venue. So we have the standard process, which is from the hub to the venue and then back to the hub. That's what we're calling the standard process. Then there is 2 additional options. If you choose that your national federation through your NOC, you decide to ship your boats on your own, however it would be at your own cost. So you ship from your country to Tokyo, all of those is at your cost. However, you have the option to use the Tokyo 2020 freight support plan for the return journey, but it would have to go back to Philippi or Empaha workshops. And vice versa, if you choose to use the freight support plan to take your boats to Tokyo and then wish to send your boats directly back to your country, you're able to do so. However, the second leg of the journey would be at your cost. One important point to clarify is if you choose either of these additional options, you must use Yamato's customs clearance service. This is because there's a lot of paperwork involved, and we need to ensure that your boats arrive and also depart and don't get stuck at customs. So really important you use Yamato's clearance procedures for that. And one other item is Yamato is the only freight forwarder who can deal with 45-foot containers. Then moving to the delivery windows. For the Olympic Games, the first window is following the World Cup 2 in Varese. So you need to deliver your boats to the hubs between the 4th and 8th of May. And the current estimated time for these boats to arrive in Tokyo is around the 26th, 27th of June. The second delivery window is following final Olympic qualification in Lucerne. And here we have a tighter amount of time between the final Olympic qualification and the start of the Games. And here, the hub will only be Empache. This is because we have a direct shipping route from Germany to Japan and ensure that there's no delays. So the delivery windows on the final day of the Olympic qualification regatta, 19th of May and 20th of May. And we estimate that these boats would arrive 10th and 11th of July. And for the Paralympics, it's following the third World Cup in Lucerne. So delivery window is between the 25th and 29th of May, and to arrive in Tokyo 14th, 15th of August. The venue lockdown date has been confirmed. It's the 6th of July. So on this date, we will not be able to accept any deliveries at the venue. It's when they do the full security sweep, and we will not have access to the venue on that day. However, it is possible to bring containers after the 6th of July. It will just take a bit longer to get through the security process clearance system. The equipment that you can include in the containers, so it's 1 boat per qualified crew, and then up to 6 boats per national federation, 6 spare boats. Then you have the opportunity to have up to 2 machines, so either 2 ergometers, 1 ergo, 1 stationary bike, or 2 stationary bikes. And these are for teams who have 12 or more athletes. The other items that can be included are riggers, oars, trestles, and boat covers. Anything outside this list will need to be shipped separately through your National Olympic Committee, National Paralympic Committees. Now, a bit of an update on television. So we will have a full live coverage of the Olympics. In the start area, we will have 2 drones, and that's up to 750 meters where we have a bridge crossing the course. Then from the bridge until the finish, we'll have a fly cam. And as well as these, we'll have the TV cats, as well as the cars following on the road. There is a new aspect for Tokyo 2020, which we'd like to highlight. It's what OBS is calling behind the scenes. So 1 hour before racing, OBS crew will be in the boathouse area, and they will film some of the preparations. They will not conduct any interviews. It's only filming, and they will not get in the way of your team preparations. It's been agreed that they can go around the boat racks, indoor and outdoor, go into the boat builders area, as well as ergometers and the athlete dining. There will be a full briefing with the TV crew when they arrive on site to ensure that they do not affect any of the teams. OBS think it's a very exciting opportunity. They will provide this footage to all of the host broadcasters in advance, so that they can, in advance of racing, so that they can do an introduction to the racing on that day. They will also, so the main period will be 1 hour before racing. However, if throughout the competition they see something exciting or emotional, etc., that they think will be interesting to TV audience, they will film that and make that available to the host broadcasters. So something a bit different than previous games. For the Paralympics, for the first time we will have live coverage, which is very exciting. So it'll be full coverage over 2,000 meters each day of racing. We will have one drone in the start area, so from the start to the bridge, and then there will be a TV catamaran on the water for the last 1,000 meters, as well as TV cars. However, there will be no fly cam for the Paralympics. After this presentation, Henk-Jan will be talking about the weather from Tokyo following the Junior Championships, but we'd like to inform you that we will make the historical weather data available from the 1st of July to the 30th of September from the Junior Championships. The exact platform, how we share it, is still to be decided. It will either be through the FISA website or the NOC services platform. And the data will be CVS format. We need to gather a bit more information from the team, so we'll be sending out a short questionnaire soon. And it's regarding training camps. Is your team planning to have a training camp in the run-up to the Olympics, Paralympics? What is your scheduled date to arrive at the venue, either to unload containers or to start training? Will you be using the freight support plan or not? And regarding ice baths, team tents, are you planning to bring an ice bath team tent to Tokyo or to rent? Does it need power or not? And if any teams are staying outside the village, all of this information would really help with our logistics and preparations. So that's the last update from us. We have 244 days to go to the Olympics and 276 to the Paralympics. Thank you. If you have any questions?
Other than the 6th of July, when does the delivery window open for containers?
So the delivery window for containers can be before or after the 6th of July. So depending on what you're looking at doing, you need to contact us to inform us.
Because we will be very early.
Yeah, that's okay.
Rental bike is the same of the Junior World Championship?
Yes.
Terrible. Terrible bike.
It's the bikes.
Very little.
It's a challenge that we have in Tokyo. It will be the same bikes.
Natalie? Thank you. All right, good morning. I'd like to inform you a little bit about how we prepare for Tokyo and what's about fairness. So just to make sure what the possibilities are that fairness committee can do at the Olympic, the first thing we can do is the most important thing is planning, so that we have the racing at the right time. That means that the usual time that is foreseen in the program now can be changed if there's some kind of weather that needs to be avoided. So we need to know about the weather and how it reacts. I'll tell you about that. But if the time is set for the racing day, then we can do several things. We can shift lanes. We have 8 lanes to choose from, and sometimes we want to have the boats into the wind or out of the wind, so we can choose that any time on the day as a fairness committee. We can also postpone. If there's something we didn't expect, we can stop racing and say, well, we wait for an hour or a day, or, well, that's probably not more than that. But it can be done at any time during racing. There's some limits, but we can reallocate. If we don't have a possibility to avoid adverse weather conditions, that means unfair weather conditions, we have to cope with it. And there's an accepted way of doing that in placing the first qualified crews in the best lanes. That means that we don't have the chevron on the lake, but more one line of racing. Well, it's not the best we have, but it's accepted and usable in certain conditions. And if everything fails, we hope for the best. And in the end, it's an outdoor sport, so sometimes you have to cope with the circumstances and be sure that we do everything to avoid unfair conditions. But we're not able to do everything, of course. So to prepare the planning, that's the main thing we do. We have this weather team, that's me and Peter Cookson in the back. And we are working for more than a year now to collect data and to make models for using to plan the racing at the right moment. And our goal is to have a model like this that we're using in Amsterdam, but also Rotterdam and other venues, that shows when it's safe to race and when we have to do something different. That means we have green areas. All circles are different wind speeds. So the first circle is 4 meters a second. Below 4 meters a second, usually there's no problem. And if there's more wind, then we can choose in different situations not to race, the red areas, or to have this reallocation, for instance, or when we are safe, that's the green areas. And we try to make a model for every venue this year so that we have enough information to be able to check for the racing times, postpone if necessary, but in the end to have everyone able to have as fair racing as possible. That's the goal. So what can we expect in Tokyo? Tokyo, in essence, is in the middle of the sea. This is Japan. Tokyo is over there. You probably know this already. This is the location we have rowing. So you can imagine if there is a sudden wind, and that's most of the time, there's a long way to build up and to have nice wind in this area. Well, you have seen other pictures too. This is the direction of the course, 75 degrees from the north, and it looks like this. And this is early in the morning. So, what we have, I have to do this twice, yes. What we do is we collect on-site weather patterns, and also we collect daily weather forecast. We do this all year round, so for every day we want to have a forecast and we want to connect this to the actual weather on the Red Lake, because the forecast is made on an airfield close nearby, but it doesn't say all about the situation at the rowing course. So we want to connect the forecast to the actual situation. And then we will reverse the connection, that we can put in a weather forecast and see what the average situation on the lake has been in the previous year. So sometimes we know that in a southern wind, we have southern wind on the lake. Not always, I'll show it later. But in other wind situations, there might be some turning of the wind in the lake. And it's important to know, because that may be a reason to postpone racing or do something else. So that's a lot of data. More in general, this is the temperature. So as you can see, in the period July, beginning of August, it's the highest temperature they can offer us. And even if it's cloudy, it's bearable outside. But if there's a clear sky, it's very hot to be in the sun. And well, it's not trainable, but you have to cope with that. The other thing is the wind direction. The main part in this period, the wind is coming from the south, but not all the time. And during the World Junior Championships, we had about 4 thunderstorms, typhoons, that coming in the area of the Big Isle of Japan. And depending on the course of the typhoon, it influences the weather on site. And it's very difficult to forecast how the wind will be on the rowing side, depending on the course of the typhoons. We have 2 very good weather guys from Japan on site, and they help us very well to investigate the possible patterns that will happen, but still we need to know in what situation, what changes in wind direction will have which effect on the course. And that's why we try to have all those wind data. So at the course we have 5 weather stations on the north side and 3 on the south side. And that's why the location where we get our data from. And during the World Championships Junior, we also had 4 buoys on the water to see the effect of the wind on water level. I'll show that later. So this is our information we can get and what we want to use to build our models. This is a model of the weather forecast that you can expect. Just the same period, southern wind in these first 3 days of the Junior World Championships, and you can see all necessary information, of course. But there's one catch, and I think it's nice to know. Some reason they recalculate the forecast on one reference weather station, and that's this weather station. And there's one tricky point on this weather station, because in this area here we have some small hills, and that causes some wind shadow, especially on this weather station. So if we have a wind forecast for 3 meters a second, that will be a reference on this weather station. But as you can see here also, this is a low wind speed, but on the other side of the lake, the wind speeds are much higher. So if you're on the grandstand, you say, well, it was 3 meters a second, it can be 6 or 7 on the other side of the lake. And that's because we have this reference point. It's not a problem, but it's good to know. So, this is 1 month of wind and temperature data. This is the period we had the World Championships for juniors, and we had mainly southern wind. So this is 180 degrees, this is northern wind, this also, and you can see that we had a good stable wind during the racing, and that is a crosswind, a cross tailwind on the lake. And usually that's a reason to be alarmed and to have all the red flags for unfair conditions, especially with those wind speeds. Wind speeds were up to 6 meters a second, and that's the average wind speed. We had gusts go to 12 meters a second. But we were surprised that in these conditions, in the southern wind that has been the most available wind that week, we had very fair conditions. We had no statistic abnormalities, because that's also what we do. We have some statistics, we have predictions for results that matches the actual results, and that was a good comforting thought that even with a cross tailwind, we had good conditions. The other thing that's interesting to know is that with those wind speeds on other lakes, you have high waves and probably white caps on the waves. But because we have salt water here, it's a little bit heavier. It takes more energy to get bad weather in this lake. Dus we can have a little bit more wind than usual before it gets unrowable. The other thing you can see here is the humidity and the temperature, and you can imagine that high temperatures and high humidity can be also a reason to stop racing if the wet bulb measurement is above 32.8, then it's unsafe to row. And during the junior World Championships, Junior Rowing World Championships. We almost hit that mark. It was 38.6 or 7, but it can be that hot. All right. So this is an animation of how we collect the data and what we do with it. The red arrow here is the weather forecast, and the others are all the measuring points we have. So we have the land weather stations that I showed before, but we also had our own weather stations, the small Kestrel weather station that we use, and we had 4 weather buoys on site on this position, very low on the water. So you can see the weather forecast was like this, and that matches more or less our reference point, but on the other weather stations, those are 10 meters above sea level. That's the same level as the course, obviously. You can see there's some different length, that means higher speeds than our reference point and our forecast. But still, there was no reason to be alarmed for unfair conditions. Normally I would be very nervous about it, but it was good. So the other thing that you can see here, that you don't see here, is the bridge. And, sorry. Yeah, seen that before. Yeah, there we are. So here's the bridge, and somehow we get some acceleration under the bridge. So the wind is tunneled into this bridge, and every crew seems to have an acceleration under the bridge. That's not because they want to sprint on that position, but somehow they get a little push behind. And we asked some crews that have been rowing on the one side and the other side, said, well, it seems to be the same on both sides, but it's interesting to see that you get a push from the wind from that side. All right, so this is how it can look. The wave attenuators, the wave absorbers have been mentioned. There are 3 of them on both sides and in the middle between the warm-up area and the racing area. They work very well. We had some gaps during the juniors, but I think they will be fixed for next year. And there's almost no wave bouncing from the shores. It can be rough. I hope you can see this picture, but there are some waves, and so be sure that you train also on not so flat water, because it can be difficult to row. It will be difficult for everyone, but it can be difficult. Well, you can see the picture. It is also possible to have this. It's very nice, like we want to have it. It's a little bit early, so I was very glad that the racing days are a little bit earlier than the training days, but maybe we can use them to have better racing. So that's what we do in general. So if anyone has questions about it. All right. Then we have fair and good racing next year, and I hope you prepare well. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. We've just got one very short bit of video we'd like to show you before lunch. So I'd like to introduce Sarah, who's just going to say a few words, and then we're going to watch a little bit of video, and she's going to be outside in the foyer bit there, so if you want to go and talk to her, but she'll tell you about what.
Hello everyone, my name's Sarah and I'm here today representing Rowers Against Rubbish. We are a movement of former rowers and also just community members. We're currently based around Marlow, which is obviously an amazing boat club right on the Thames, but we're currently expanding out. And I just wanted to show you a really brief clip from a film which is called A Plastic Ocean. And this was a documentary that firstly really inspired us and helped us to put RA together. And secondly has been something that we've actually been able to take to the community. We've hosted a screening of this documentary at Marlow Rowing Club for the community. And essentially, I think if I leave you with one message today, it's that we believe that boat clubs form the heart of communities and that there's a real opportunity ultimately for for the passion of the rowers and the people connected to the club to have a positive environmental change in their communities. Thank you.
Shall we show it before we start this afternoon session? Yeah, okay. They didn't have time to see that it was working properly. So we'll show it before this afternoon session. But Sarah will be outside, and if you want to know what they're doing and how they're doing it, then please go and talk to her. Thank you.